Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and also want to thank my panelists who are part of the conversation today on Cloudy with a Chance of Privileged Access Management. So before we sort of dive into some key topics and sort of the overall interesting conversations around cloud and privileged access management, just want to do a quick introduction about myself and sort of the panelists, and sort of we'll dive into some of the good conversations around, how do you look at things when it comes to privileged access management, especially with cloud and the adoption of cloud. So I am Ketan Kapadia, and I've been in the identity and access management space for about 20 years, spent a lot of my time over the last 20 years working with customers, enabling IAM PAM platforms, and also spent a lot of time dealing with executives to really establish some key initiatives when it comes to securing that access, not only from an identity perspective, but also looking at things from a privileged access management perspective. And with that, Tiffany, can you please introduce yourself to our audience today?
Sure, Ketan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tiffany Yim. I'm the Senior Director of IAM Architecture in Global Cybersecurity at RBC. And my team and I are responsible for the architecture and design of IAM shared services at the bank. These services provide IAM security controls for apps that businesses want to use at RBC, whether the apps are deployed on-prem, in public cloud, or are SaaS apps. And these services can also be used by app dev teams that want to build apps that require controls to prevent unauthorized access. So we're currently working through many of the considerations and challenges with ensuring that risk associated with privileged access is still acceptable to RBC, even when some of those traditional security controls like perimeter security, manual reviews, non-personal accounts, and so on, they perhaps no longer apply in the new environments, or they no longer provide as much mitigation of risk as they did before. So it's an interesting and evolving space, to say the least. And on top of privileged access, I'm also responsible for the oversight of architectures and designs for all of the workforce IAM and customer IAM capabilities. So authentication, authorization, secrets management, user and credential management, identity and fraud analytics, and identity and access reporting. So I'm delighted to be with you here today to discuss some of these challenges.
Thank you, Tiffany. Jason, would you like to go ahead, please?
Sure. Jason Mitchell, Senior Vice President of Engineering at Centrify. And Centrify is a privileged access management vendor. The reason I got into the security space, I've sort of been in, enterprise IT for a long time, but I love working in security because I kind of feel like I tell my children I feel like Batman. I feel like I'm fighting the bad guys. There's a real purpose behind and a mission behind security. So I really like this space and enjoy it a lot. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Omar?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Omer Ahmed, Managing Partner of Cybersecurity Security Solutions, based out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and been in the privileged access management, security architecture, design and implementation, and PAM programs for about the last decade. In my role at Ipsiety, we're helping our clients and customers securely navigate their digital transformation journeys. And part of that, and at the heart of that, is privileged access and management. And we've been helping our customers over the last year under extraordinary circumstances, dealing with a host of new use cases and security risks and threats related to privileged access, and happy to support Canadian women in cybersecurity, a great initiative, and happy to be here.
Thanks, Omar. So I guess just to sort of set the stage, right? So according to the 2020 Verizon data breach and incident report, 77% of cloud breaches are due to compromised credentials. And a number of these attacks have more than doubled since 2019. And obviously, I think the COVID had to play kind of a big impact to that overall, right? And it is estimated that by the end of 2021, the public cloud infrastructure is going to grow by 35%. And obviously partially this is due to the COVID elements, but I think many organizations are also now sort of taking that to really accelerate some of those things as they move from a offering digital services to their customers, right? And obviously with the cloud adoption, with the capability of always on and sort of that internet connected global marketplace, the traditional approaches we've been sort of taking from a perimeter perspective, which is over firewalls, VPNs, and various other tools are slowly disappearing, right? So this sort of new normal requires how we manage both the human and non-human privilege accounts that access our critical data, the applications that are hosted on the cloud, and also sort of the IT services as we as administrators log into sort of these cloud aspects, not only from an application perspective, but also from an infrastructure perspective. So as part of our panel discussion today, our goal is to discuss some of these challenges and also look at areas where organization can focus when it comes to sort of, ensuring that, the privilege access from a cloud perspective is sort of, taken seriously, but also look at areas on how they can help curb some of the elements to really adopt that list privilege model. So with that, I guess first question to you, Jason, what are, some of the modern challenges of privilege access management lifecycle with cloud adoption do you see out there, especially as you sort of connect with your customers and some of the challenges that they are seeing?
Yeah. Well, any kind of change is hard, and the cloud represents a lot of change. If you think about it, there's new architectures, new technologies, and even new methodologies. Just take architecture, for example. We used to have big monolithic applications, and now they're broken into microservices, and they're connected, with service meshes, and you've got clusters of resources now collecting lots of data and storing that. And then the cloud infrastructure also is built for auto scaling, so it automatically scales up and scales down as needed. How do you make sure you have proper identity and access provisioned and deprovisioned during that auto scale? And then technologies like serverless and containers and new methods of compute. Services are now connected via APIs, edge, mobile, Internet of Things. It's just the attack surface is expanding. And all of these services need to be able to communicate with each other securely. And so you've got secrets and keys that need to be protected. And then methodologies are different. You've got infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, and thinking about ephemeral resources. It's a big shift from human identities to service and machine-based identities, and the privilege access management solution needs to evolve. But with these new challenges, comes new opportunities. There's lots of solutions out there, lots of tools that will help solve, a variety of needs that you might have. But, PAM is about creating a strategy and a system for managing the identities with privilege access in a comprehensive and manageable way. That's the key, is something that can easily be managed. My recommendation is to be thoughtful about a PAM strategy and implementation, because identity and access management will be the heart of all things security.
Thanks. And I guess, Tiffany, from your perspective, and obviously you've been in your role, and obviously your interaction on how you deal with your business is also unique in the sense of you're not only looking at it from an application perspective, but also from an infrastructure perspective. So do you have any insights to share with the audience on this particular topic?
Yes, I think the key that we try to keep in mind all the time is the risk posture, right? So whichever organization you're looking to basically make sure that as your organization moves from apps that are deployed on-prem to private cloud to public cloud to SaaS, let's say, that the risk posture that's adopted with these changes is still in line with the appetite of the organization. And I think as some of the controls that we used to use to perhaps lower risk are no longer as effective as before, or perhaps they don't apply in the new environment, we have to find new ways of doing things. And I think one of the challenges that we've seen is that there's been a proliferation of tools and solutions. I think Jason touched on this a bit. And as much as possible, we want to try to have a uniform approach to managing privileged access. And from the regulatory point of view, at least from the financial services side, it is a bit of a management nightmare to kind of bring in new tools for new environments. It's a bit untenable because then you're trying to kind of demonstrate traceability to meeting regulatory requirements and audit requirements. But you've got, as you add tools and processes, you're kind of multiplying the number of times you need to do that. So definitely a balancing act, and trying to find a solution that fits all these use cases has taken up quite a bit of our time.
Omar, do you want to add any insights?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the experience of our clients and customers has been as Tiffany mentioned, getting a unified compliance and regulatory view on privileged access risk across the public cloud that they consume. Now, that's quite a mouthful to swallow, but very important to customers in critical infrastructure in the banking sector, where very strict regulatory frameworks apply. So I think some of the challenges that we've seen from senior leadership at our customers is the desire to get a unified risk prioritized view of privileged access in their cloud footprint, because it's growing. And as they digitally transform, they are consuming, as Jason mentioned, all the nuances of the cloud story. And so there's a desire to maintain a compliance and lifecycle control over that privileged access. And that I find is a key concern that's come up as the workforce has moved remote and is more and more ingressing critical spaces through the cloud. Again, from that third-party contractor point of view as well, the remote workforce, it's adding a bit of complexity. And as Tiffany mentioned, the other business desire is not to proliferate point solutions to address that risk. So because obviously that adds complexity to the operational aspect of maintaining those technologies. So a lot of the effort and the desire has been to take a step back and understand and risk prioritize these new areas that we have to deal with, but at the same time, not to proliferate technologies and point solutions, but to come with a more of a holistic picture that Jason was kind of alluding to, right?
Thanks, Omar. So obviously, just sort of adding on to that, right? So I think when we talk about the proliferation of services, right? Obviously, agile DevOps is sort of a big conversation for every organization today, right? Everybody wants to move faster, do things from an agile perspective. How do you see the challenges associated when we look at sort of cloud PAM with the context of DevOps? Because, obviously, I know I have talked to folks where, as we move towards DevOps, the whole secrets management and all those things become kind of interesting. testing. So what are you kind of seeing out there, Omar, and kind of what is it that you can share with the audience today?
Yeah, so at a lot of our customers and clients, a lot of the revenue generating aspect of the business is really driven by this digital transformation and the new ways that services are delivered to their customers. So that involves a really rapid, high velocity, continuous integration, continuous development life cycle, typically taking place in very high velocity environments in the cloud. So as Jason mentioned, this is not your grandfather's or grandmother's PAM that needs to address this velocity that's taking place in the DevOps environment. So, and the complexity for example, a large financial institution like a bank would be, there are various developer communities within a bank. So it's not a monolithic approach that we can take to address all their use cases. To step back and arrive at a common reference architecture for secrets management, specifically at the scale and velocity that Jason mentioned. The scaling up, the scaling down, and all the nuances of secrets and API keys and all that management at high velocity. And keeping the governance around it, a new notion of governance, not the traditional human identity governance lifecycle, but there's going to be a different mentality and life cycle to manage these secrets. So it's a new area, and a lot of the PAM vendors are proposing approaches, and so it's a matter of evaluating the approach for a particular customer and their size of their environments.
Thanks, Omar. Tiffany, Omar, anything you would, and Jason, anything you would like to add there?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to touch on Omer's point about governance, right, and how organizations are trying to automate that governance today. So, when it comes to general security testing, let's say, making sure that an application can pass those tests at certain gates before they're allowed to proceed to a higher environment. So I think that's one of the items that we're trying to enforce some of the security controls that we provide. So depending on the risk level of an application, you may need to, for example, ensure that the application is, let's say, storing their secrets in some sort of secrets management service and can retrieve them at deployment time or at initiation time, let's say when containers are being spun up or when VMs are being spun up. So, there's kind of that challenge, in that before it was more that, you're looking at a solution on-prem and you need to provide some mechanism for secrets retrieval on-prem. Now secrets retrieval needs to happen, on-prem and in public cloud. So how do you kind of unify and rationalize those solutions, right? And then I think also for the pipelines themselves, right? The deployment pipelines, they also have secrets that they need to access when they're performing, these tasks that are written in the run books, right? And there's kind of an opportunity there to, with some of the larger pipelines at an organization, to integrate both the pipelines themselves and the applications that are deployed through that pipeline to some common tools and to implement some common processes.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, it's the other thing that is, I lead an engineering team, and so we have engineering and cloud operations, and we've felt this ourselves as we shift to DevOps. It's a mindset shift. You're talking about two, traditionally siloed groups now starting to work much closer together to enable that velocity that Omar was speaking about. It's about sharing requirements and sharing feedback and working together to ensure high quality services at that are secure, and how do you maintain that regulatory compliance and those controls as you make that shift? I mean, the way to do that is to collaborate and be working together and be really agile with each other. It's a big impact on just the organization, not just the tooling and the implementations. It's the right path forward for sure, but it requires people, process, and culture to really change to deliver on DevOps.
Thanks, Jason. So, and obviously, I think as organizations are moving to the cloud, right? There's also, now we kind of look at the business IT can easily move to the cloud, and there's this whole concept around how do we control sort of these privilege entitlements as you sort of move towards the cloud. So Tiffany, based on sort of your role, your experience, and sort of interacting with the business internally at the bank, what are some of the things you're seeing when it comes to when we look at that whole privilege entitlements aspect of things as you look at sort of the traditional versus sort of the new world from a cloud perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, businesses want to make it easy for their users to request access, for the custodians to approve access, and they basically want to plug into existing or IAM services that provide them with these capabilities rather than having to build it themselves all the time. So, going back to the theme of, trying to use the same systems, the same tools, the same processes, that, we want to really use that same pane of glass for, whether the business application or the business service is deployed on-prem or in public cloud. We want to be able to provide, equivalent controls, whether it's requesting access, assessing it, approving it, or provisioning it, right? And in terms of keeping track of who has access to what, I mean, that's still critically important. And so we want to be able to, in a unified and easy way, be able to tell who has what type of access, what kind of access at what time. And even though that access, it's maybe it's originating or sourced from let's say one set of data, that needs to be provisioned out to many different places, right? Whether it's some sort of authorization service in public cloud, or to an app specific entitlement repository. Like most SaaS apps, you need to manage access to them independently, right? So I think keeping that access in one place, but then provisioning it out to many places is key to trying to make this easy, right? And of course, as much as possible, we try to come up with consistent patterns so that, for example, if your app is able to support, let's say, a certain protocol like SCIM or SPLO, even, or they can provide JIT provisioning with an identity assertion. Those are patterns that we try to bubble up, right? And also to help SaaS teams to even assess what tooling they can use based on which controls they are able to implement using existing patterns. So I think, those are some of the ways that, we are looking to control privileged access and privileged entitlements out there in the public cloud.
Thanks, Tiffany. Jason, from your perspective, obviously, you are wearing the hat from the other side from a vendor perspective. What are some of the things that you're seeing when it comes to, things that you're hearing from your customers around this whole cloud entitlement elements instead of getting a control and visibility around that?
Yeah, well, the other big thing is, SaaS apps, so it's not just the internal services that teams are creating, but it's getting control of the identities and the access and privilege access with SaaS apps. And so, there's solutions that help with that, to help with the federated identities and the delegated access control. There's protocols like SAML and OAuth. Single sign-on was a big step forward in trying to get manage, get control of the identities with all of these SaaS applications. But don't forget about the other identities, things like app stores. If your teams are publishing mobile apps in the iOS or the Android App Store, there's identities there. Think of social media accounts, your Facebook and Twitter and Instagram accounts for your corporation. That's an identity. And if you're on public clouds, there's root accounts. Those things also need to be stored and managed and audited. And the key is a comprehensive system for managing identities and privilege access, avoiding the duplicate identities and trying to tie all these identities to an enterprise directory. Try to figure out ways. My recommendation is figure out ways to centralize the access management. It makes it simpler, which means it's easier to enforce and harder to expose, cracks or gaps in the strategy.
Thanks. Omar, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, no, I would echo the sentiments. And I think some of the most prevalent threats that we see across all customers and practically all verticals is often misconfigured privileged access on those cloud platforms and services. So it's not as trivial as the the root account for the AWS console, as Tiffany and Jason can attest to. It's more the internal backend services that are delivered on those public cloud platforms that use a very granular system of roles and entitlements for each of those services to operate. So whenever we land at a customer, when we do assess the initial situation, the immediate findings are misconfigured permissions on S3 buckets and other types of situations where inadvertently the threat profile is great, whereas few simple controls and a unified point of view would have the greatest risk mitigation and reduce that level of risk. So those are quick wins that we've seen at some of our customers where we assess that privilege sprawl and granularity in each of the different nuanced public cloud platforms. And so it's often quite startling and surprising to clients when they do have that unified view and they see that cumulative risk that exists across their cloud footprint. So it's often an eye-opening kind of situation, and it often leads to a risk prioritized program to kind of address these areas. So.
Thanks, Omar. And obviously, I think, as we kind of look at sort of, PAM in general, right? And I think with all these different digital services sprawling, we're also seeing many organizations also, obviously partnering with third-party vendors and other organizations to really help deliver those services from an organization perspective. And I think part of those elements is also looking at what does that overall seamless user experience kind of looks like. So again, I guess, and I'll kind of start with you, Tiffany, right? So obviously, from where you are, from your role perspective, right? Obviously, achieving that seamless experience for your third-party vendors or even for your internal users. How do we sort of achieve this? Obviously, when it comes to the cloud, are there any implications? Are there things that, as organizations sort of start mapping their sort of the cloud journey, especially around privilege access management, are there things that they need to think of as to how do we encompass this sort of flow to ensure that things are sort of easy for the users rather than making it more complicated, because now we are no longer in this perimeter of these four walls, but really, we now have this, open space that I can, onboard a SaaS application, or I can have multiple hybrid cloud platforms as an organization to support my different needs. So, what are some other things that you're seeing, and do you see any implications of sort of trying to achieve some of these key capabilities?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have hundreds of SaaS apps I'm sure the businesses are using, and definitely, with the cloud services providers themselves, there's lots of access and privileged access there that needs to be managed. So at the end of the day, I mean, there's one end of the spectrum where you could look at each of these as their own, their own snowflake, basically, and try to figure out how users should authenticate to these services after you've provisioned access to them, or to at the other end of the spectrum, try to move to something that's a bit more centralized. And of course, the latter is the most efficient way, as I think we've talked about quite a bit so far. So, I mean, just centralizing the authentication services and the authentication capabilities at the organization is key. It also makes for a much better user experience. So, users are not trying to manage many different sets of credentials, which, leads to, other problems like credential reuse across different applications that we all know about. So, by centralizing authentication services, then you're able to layer controls on as you need to. So, for example, a low-risk app, perhaps just using being able to reuse an employee's primary credentials, if it's not privileged access, to single sign-on into that application, that is kind of at the lower level of risk. And then as you need to increase authentication insurance, you could add additional multi-factor authenticators or additional authenticators that have been provisioned to that group of employees. And then, of course, the protocols that help us to enable single sign-on. So, whether it's SAML or OIDC, when you need portable identity assertions, or if you're trying to manage authorization, then OAuth 2, right? Those are some of the patterns that, going back to the pattern-based approach that, we're trying to basically make sure that apps are able to support or have those capabilities so that we're able to authenticate centrally and then provide a portable identity assertion or an access token over to those applications to basically help them to determine how the user is authorized, and so that they don't actually need to worry about authenticating the user at all, just validating the identity assertion or access token that's provided over at the time of sign-in.
Thanks. Omar, anything you want to add?
No, I think the point that the authentication methods have to be ubiquitous. In other words, they can, having proprietary protocols are not serving the purpose. So open standards, open authentication standards, open consent models like OAuth 2 are very, very critical because we can extend those consent models across many, many use cases and derive the required security controls and consents. And I think that's a very critical point that Tiffany mentioned.
Thanks, Omar. And I'm sure, yeah, I think Jason, from your perspective, again, and I think from an Omar, it's coming from a practitioner perspective, from a Tiffany perspective, dealing with sort of the internal businesses and sort of the partners. Now, how do you see things play out when you're sort of putting on your vendor hat and sort of connecting with your customers as to the things they are trying to see, or sort of the challenges that you as an organization from a Centrify that you're trying to solve?
Yeah. As a vendor, it's a big a core tenet of our capabilities and that we offer. Tiffany's right. It's a spectrum, and at the one, it can't be a one-off. You can't let a contractor come in and have someone manually provision or give access. Every time that happens, that just is a recipe for a mistake, forgetting about something, forgetting to turn it off. There needs to be a system in place to automatically provision an identity, grant them with the least privileges or whatever minimum privileges that are needed, and then either deprovision the privileges or the identity entirely. Outsourced IT contractors, they really need to come in through the same secure access method as internal administrators and internal folks and internal services. And then, not to mention it, if you do separate it, then how you going to monitor that, and how you going to audit that, and where's the traceability in that? So, as a vendor, I'm completely supportive of a centralized system that allows for both internal and external administrators to go through, so that you can put the right authentication in place, establish the right identity, and give them the right access that they needed while removing it or limiting what they can do when they're in there.
No, so you I think touched a very key element around the identity aspect, right? So obviously, I think if you looked at traditional PAM has always been sort of looked from the context of a privilege account, right? But I think um, you know to sort of provide that continuous visibility, monitoring, and compliance, I guess organizations need to really focus on that identity centric approach when it comes to privilege access management, which has sort of not been the traditional approach. So, you know, can you share some thoughts around, why is this critical as organizations, move towards the cloud adoption?
Yeah, this one's a really good question. This is a really good point here. If you just take a step back, if you think about, you're building a system to manage, the privileged access, and if you build it around or design it around multiple anchor points, it just becomes too hard to manage. It's too hard to set up. It's too hard to adapt. Too hard to trace, and it makes it too easy to make a mistake. You have to pick something and design a strategy and implementation around that. We used to use the network. We had tools like firewalls, ports, and protocols, and other network-based resource management. But when mobile and the cloud came around, that network perimeter it had too many holes, and it couldn't be trusted. So if you think about the least common denominator between users, services, and devices, it's identity. And so designing and building the security practice around identity is just easier to manage, which in turn makes it easier to secure. If you think about threat actors, they're really looking for the cracks in the system, the back doors, the gaps in the overlap, the identity that has more privileges than needed. That's where the threat actors are going for. And if you have too complex of a system, you can't see those things. And so simplifying it and building it around the identity is just easier to ensure that it's the most secure. So, we always recommend, start with a solid identity management system and layer on a robust privilege access management, designed around the principles of zero trust, least privileges, and just-in-time privilege elevation. And that prevents or minimizes the lateral movement, because identity will get stolen. It's not a matter of if, an identity will get stolen, and privilege access management is about preventing or minimizing that lateral movement once that identity is stolen.
Thanks, Jason. Is there anything you want to add, Tiffany, from your experience around how is sort of RBC looking at things when it comes to sort of taking that identity-centric approach in PAM?
Yeah, I like Jason's point about moving away from, or traditionally it used to be using network or infrastructure-based controls to control access, and now we're moving to an identity-based approach. And we're definitely doing that. I think the entire industry is, and an identity-based approach really provides you with greater granularity in controlling access and in applying the controls that are needed. So you can decide, for example, depending on what the user is trying to access, whether you need more authentication controls, right? Or, how often you need to certify that access. So, it allows for, I guess, a greater spectrum of controls depending on the risk that you're trying to mitigate. So that's one thing, definitely an identity first kind of approach, right? And I would say that, in terms of authorizing that identity with privileged access, we're starting to see a move away from, removing standing entitlements or standing access, so that, that access is really only provisioned when it's needed, right? This just helps to decrease the overall attack surface, so you don't have identities and associated accounts out there with all of these privileged entitlements or this privileged access that, if compromised, they can be used at that time, right? So we're looking at trying to reduce the attack surface by provisioning privileged access just in time, before it's needed.
And I think you definitely bring up a great point there. I think the whole just in time is sort of becoming that key element. And I think, being myself in the IAM space, I think, coming from that era around where you only focus on identities, but now really identities are, you have multiple accounts, and what those accounts allow you to do is kind of a key element to sort of tie all those things back. So Omar, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, 100% aligned with the previous speakers, specifically because I think there's been a realization that privilege sprawl and credential sprawl and access sprawl represents a growing risk. And to arrest that risk, I think essentially the threat actor is looking for that high privileged account to compromise that can allow them that lateral movement that Jason mentioned to a crown jewel asset. So everybody understands the impact when that happens. So therefore, what we would like to do and what we're guiding our customers is to move away from the concept of individual privileged admin accounts and tie that privileged access to an identity repository with the proper assertion. So this is not an easy problem to solve, but I believe, as the previous speakers mentioned, it's a risk mitigation strategy that yields a lot of benefits, because what you end up doing is you end up reducing the overall sort of pool of privileged access that exists standing wise in your environment that a threat actor can compromise. So once you transition away from that standing privilege and you move to a just-in-time, not too hot, not too cold, just right type of access, it seemed in the past that it was an unattainable goal, but I think working with the vendors that are out there that are also shifting in their mindset, it's been easier to work with customers to deliver on that kind of promise. So
Thanks. So I definitely want to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A, but I guess just kind of a last thing, like I think for every panelist, is there one thing that you would kind of like to share with the audience from your experience as to if organizations are looking at, cloud and sort of PAM, what is that one thing that they need to ensure that they include as part of their assessment strategy, or as they sort of move forward from a cloud perspective? And if you don't mind me putting you on the hot seat, Tiffany, if that's okay, to answer that question first.
Sure. Yeah. So for us, and maybe it's because I work in financial services at this time, the risk assessment is key, right? So just understanding what the threat model is, what threats and risks we need to mitigate in order to make sure that using this business sponsored application or building this application in-house, whatever it is that we're trying to apply IAM controls to generally, that A, those controls are needed, right? And B, what is the residual risk after providing those controls? I think, just from a cost containment perspective, we want to basically reduce the number of controls as much as possible while keeping the risk level to be, at a level that's acceptable to the business. And also from a usability point of view, right? Like if for example, your app really doesn't need higher authentication assurance, then do we really need to put the user through second factor authentication, right? Or reduce the timeouts on the application so that they authenticate more frequently and so on, right? So I think there's always a balance, which makes this domain quite very interesting. And then from my point of view, in architecture and design, just trying to push out or to publish as many patterns as possible so that we're not kind of reinventing the wheel every time. So that, when we enable a capability, that it is easy for it to be reused when it's needed. And so those are two of the thoughts that I would like to share.
Thanks, Tiffany. Jason?
Yeah, I think I would say as a PAM vendor, to embrace the digital transformation and the cloud transformation and enable it. Don't let the shift to the cloud sort of just catch you by surprise that you're going to respond to it with a tooling and a system. Select a strategy and an implementation that enables that. Think of developers who are writing, they're creating applications and services and creating infrastructure as code scripts. Does your PAM solution have the tooling and the documentation that it makes it easy for them to go to? The thing about people inside of organizations, they're going to go to the path to whatever's the path of least resistance. So if it's hard to integrate with the PAM solution, and then they're not going to do it. They're going to go around it. They're going to pick their own vault or pick something inside of Azure. And then all of a sudden another team decides to go with Google Cloud or decides to go with AWS. And now you've got 2 vault systems and 2 key stores. And so, the PAM strategy really needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to enable and make it easy and make it the path of least resistance for folks to integrate with the PAM solution to get their job done.
Thank you. Omar?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the previous sentiments, and I think I would pick up one point from Tiffany, the risk prioritized roadmap rather than our traditional sort of gap analysis target roadmap. It's a lot of times when our customers are faced with challenges of privileged access in the cloud, a lot of times it's a boil the ocean and a paralysis because there's so many challenges. So the reality of the matter is, as if we have a risk prioritized approach, then it allows us to mitigate the key crown jewel asset risks that an organization like a bank would like to protect. As we've worked in critical infrastructure areas like electrical utilities, nuclear power generating plants, the restrictions and the risks evolve from confidentiality and integrity to availability, life, and safety. So we've seen several instances over the past year where privilege abuse and privilege compromise led to very serious situations, and moving our workforce to the cloud has in a way exacerbated that a bit. And so we're coming with a risk prioritized approach to pivot and apply the architecture patterns that Tiffany mentioned in a repeatable way to address these new areas of risk. So.
Great. So I know we have some questions over here. So let's kind of go to this. I think the first question is, I guess, the individual over here, obviously as an organization, they're trying to adopt to public cloud at an exponential rate. However, they are at risk with integration with third-party application services and interacting at obviously that are going to be interacting with their digital crown jewels. So I guess the question over here is, are organizations out there reaching out to vendors to update their contractual language to ensure that they have strong controls to protect the credentials during the application registration or even the consent grant process? So is there anything that the panelists would like to add to that?
Sure. So I both in banking and healthcare, those are the kind of 2 industries that I've spent the most time in the IAM domain working in. So I think even back in the SAML days, right, where we were setting up, kind of federation, like a federation broker kind of model. I think there are some controls that you're either dependent on these third parties to implement in order to maintain the security of the system or to protect the data that's being shared, right? So yes, I think in terms of contractual terms, yes, I have seen that, and we've worked on, for example, making sure that whether it's a relying party or a service provider or a client application, actually being able to act as a confidential client. Let's say in the OAuth 2 protocol, where that that organization that's responsible for that client application is able to keep their credentials confidential, right, in order to interact with an authorization server, or that they're able to, that they uphold their responsibilities when it comes to validating tokens that are granted to them, right? So definitely it is important to, in terms of the end-to-end security posture of a solution, to holistically look at controls that, all the entities within that solution need to implement, right? And same thing, maybe a little bit off topic here, but on the identity provider side, another participant in federation and in kind of distributed authorization systems. And yeah, I have also seen that identity providers, they're subject to even more kind of stringent requirements, especially security requirements. So how they protect identities, the credentials, how they authenticate users, and so on. And there's definitely contractual terms that I've seen being wrapped around that, as well as kind of independent security assessments and certifications that are required.
Omar, Jason, anything you have from your end, or do we want to go to the next question?
Yeah, no, I would echo, because we've had customers who have been regulated under HIPAA and PHIPAA, and there are certain privacy regulations that also apply. And we've had to do privacy impact assessments on organizations who are adopting certain PAM solutions. And right now, it's become kind of a repeatable process, and we're able to meet the requirements and the regulatory requirements. But I would echo Tiffany that, yes, in specific situations, there are contractual obligations that need to be kind of addressed. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Jason, anything you would like to add?
No, nope. I think they handled that one well.
All right. So I guess the next question was, how often do you recommend reviewing access controls within departments? So I think I think this question really boils down to, obviously, every organization, if you're SOX, right? So you do have some regular compliance requirements to do user access reviews, at least once a year. So I think some of these are sort of very, compliance driven, but I think often there are also some best practices that at least we've kind of tried to adopt is, so usually many organizations will sort of do a quarterly access controls review, and which could be a delta, but then do a yearly full access review. So I think that's something that I've kind of seen, but obviously I want to put this out to the panelists as to, what have you seen with sort of obviously your customers, or even within the organization, from with, especially for you, Tiffany, as it comes to sort of the control on how often we look at access controls in general.
Yeah, so definitely this is driven by regulatory requirements. I guess one thing that I would add to this is that, traditionally we've done mostly kind of blanket access certification campaigns, right? And, it's always kind of a drag to get the organization to do that. So as much as possible to try to scale that back and look at, whether it, typically it's business rule based access, where, within, I guess, a particular area of the organization, or a particular team or department, we've got people, in the same business roles needing similar access, right? And instead of reviewing each person's access individually, to review what that role needs access to. And then that just kind of leaves, takes away a lot of the noise, right? When an access review is being done. And then just the exceptions can be looked at, and that just, I think, reduces some of the pain and a lot of the manual work around access reviews.
Makes sense. Jason, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I would say this is a great example of, when the system is complex, this becomes a tremendous burden. But if you go, as Tiffany suggested, if you go with, 0 standing privileges and just-in-time privilege elevation, you could see how that eases the burden when it comes to auditing on a quarterly basis. If there are no standing privileges, that audit access is going to be real fast. And so, that's a great example of, the way we used to manage privilege access and how it kind of creates a burden and adds a complexity. There are ways of doing things simpler, and it not only eases the setup, but it eases the ongoing maintenance to continue, the PAM practice.
Thank you. I guess the other question is, could you talk some best practices around passwordless user access management? So I think passwordless is definitely a very interesting topic, has been around, many organized, we've been talking about passwordless for the last 10 plus years, right? But I think when it comes to, in general, sort of the passwordless access management, when it comes to sort of the uh, I think the elements around it's not only about what you do as an organization, but you also sort of need to understand as to where in the or where or how within the context of your organization, whether it be your workforce, whether it be your consumer facing stuff. I think you kind of need to really understand as to how well that model can fit and how effectively you can sort of drive that, right? So there are many passwordless technologies out there who integrate very well into the PAM vendors to sort of log into sort of the PAM solutions without a password, which does reduce some of that friction, which provides some additional layer of capability. But obviously, I think from my perspective, it's a conversation that needs to happen to see where it makes best sense from an organization and where it kind of works, right? And obviously, I also suggest is try with small group, make sure it meets your requirements, not only from a business perspective, for use case perspective, but it's also addressing your security challenges. And obviously, I definitely want to hand it over to the panels to sort of get sort of their insight and inputs on sort of the whole passwordless topic in general, especially when we look at things from a PAM perspective. So does anyone want to take a stab
Ketan,
at it?
I think I've had an experience with a customer who's explained that they quantify the dollar figure of dealing with password resets at a very large bank. And just that operational activity and reducing that friction and that ability to go passwordless was enough for them to rethink their desktop authentication solutions, right? So I do see customers adopting it, but it's not an isolated just solve an authentication problem. It's more of, okay, what business benefit are we deriving from going back passwordless, and sort of baking that figure into the overall kind of return on adopting the technology. So often I see that kind of conversation happening.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think I would add here, most of the time when people talk about passwordless, it's around the the authentication. But when you think of in a cloud transformation, you have services talking to each other. You can put the secret right in the infrastructure as code scripts in the CI/CD pipelines. But then teams start to move that to the vault. Well, you can move it to the vault, but you still need a username and a password or some sort of token to access the vault. So you've just exchanged one password to another. And so a technique that we recommend is, our solution and many other solutions would enable this is to sort of enroll the machine and create an identity of the machine. And so now the scripts don't have any passwords. The machine is allowed to talk to the vault, returns the secrets, and then the secrets can be used in the service. So, that's an example of passwordless down at a service to service level.
Okay, thank you. And I think there's one more question. I know we have a couple of minutes left over here, and I guess the question is, are you seeing challenges with users bringing in their own devices to the organization?
I think the short answer is yes on this one. So, I mean, down to making, I think this is there's a lot to unpack in this question.
Right.
But yeah, I think we're looking at controls across all security domains, not just identity, right? To to address some of these challenges, like, for example, making sure that the device has sufficient infrastructure security controls, like endpoint security, let's say, that we're not able to exfiltrate data on that device, where it should not be, right? And then on top of that, there's the IAM set of capabilities as well. So what should that user that's bringing their own device, what should that user be able to access? And the device itself, I think, going back to the passwordless question, it can be used for authentication, right, as a factor, or as one way to authenticate a user to whatever the user is trying to access. But I think the device itself needs to be secure enough to act as a factor for authentication, and also the whole binding of that device as a credential. I think there's a set of challenges there that, like going back to some of the best practices that NIST and OSFI, for example, that they put out there, where, when you're actually binding a credential, that session that credential is bound in needs to be at a high enough assurance level, so that credential can be used to increase the authentication assurance after that. So, there's a whole set of, I think, processes and tooling around that it's kind of not just, you enroll your phone, you can use it for authentication, you're good, right? While that's a way to mitigate maybe phishing, right, it's not necessarily sufficient to increase authentication assurance.
No, thanks. So I know we're at 12:31, so we've gone about a minute. So I would like to thank all my peer panelists for a great conversation today. And I know we can spend the next 2 hours talking more about this very interesting topic. So again, I wanted to thank everybody for taking the time today to connect with us and giving us an hour from your day to listen to some experts in this field and kind of share their thoughts and insights. So again, thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.